Seahawks fans, wherever you may be, welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football. Seahawks fans, welcome back to another episode of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers, and we've reached that point in the offseason where we do not have any current news to offer you and current subject matter to talk about. And so now we're going to switch over to history. We're going to give a Seahawks history lesson today for those of you who are interested. Both of us have been around this team for as long as we can both remember, albeit I've got that little stretch of extra time before Keith was even around to be a fan, and so we're going to talk about it. We're going to have a fun show. I don't know exactly where this thing is going to go, but we'll just talk about it from our own perspectives, and it should be a lot of fun. So welcome in.
Yeah. It's hopefully this is gonna be a fun show. But I was trying to research stuff and just remind myself of certain things. And I'm like, God, there's just so much info.
There's so much. It's so much.
So I'm coming into this having looked at all of that and then not even really taking notes. So we'll see.
I know.
Because I'm just like, there's so much. I'm like, let's just get in here and talk about what we want to get into. This is going to be fun. Because, I mean, we're talking about Seahawks history, so how could it not be? I want to get your take on the formation of this team and what it was like the first season.
Well, it was pretty cool, actually. So, I'm just going to age myself right off the bat, and and I'm totally fine with that. I mean, look at me. I'm not trying to hide my age. I'm actually, going for a competition to be Santa Claus this year. Really, that's my goal. Just kidding. So back in 1975-ish or 74, the back end of 74, 75, I heard about the Seahawks and the NFL coming to Seattle. My dad made me aware because he was a football fan growing up, and while I was growing up as well, and I played football as much as I could possibly play when I was a young kid, just in the backyard throwing the ball around with all my buddies and friends. I was lucky enough to have this huge flat backyard, and so all the neighborhood kids would come over, and this is where we would have the football competitions, and we would all switch positions and play, and had a great time. But so anyway, my dad was a Vikings fan early on in the process, Fran Tarkington, all that kind of stuff, and Carl Eller and Purple People Eaters. So that was part of my growing up. I always wanted to be Fran Tarkington because I was a lefty. So I'd go out in the back and I'd, practice being a lefty, and Fran Tarkington scramble around and all that kind of stuff. So found out we were going to have a team. And for Christmas, and this was 1975, just before 76, I think, my mom got the family and my dad specifically season tickets for Christmas. And I believe that the value on those tickets, face value on those tickets, and we were in the seventh row, was $15 a piece to go watch a game. And we were in section, I'm going to try to remember now, section 107, section 103, row 7, seats 1, 2, and 3. And we held those seats from 1976 until 1989. And so it was a privilege to go to quite a few games in person, almost the entire Kingdom, run, not the whole thing, but pretty decent run, and watched, Jim Zorn and Steve Largent and company in person, and John Elway would visit, and we hated him Everyone hated John Elway, and it was a lot of fun. So you go where we sat in the Kingdom were the temporary bleacher seats, and there was a lot of them in there. They bring them in and out for baseball, and these things we found out made a lot of noise. And so Seattle fans from the very, very beginning, and we didn't know anything about being fans. We didn't have any, history of professional sports, in Seattle other than the Sonics at that time. And so we figured out that if you stomped on these things, it would just be this crazy earth-shattering noise and obnoxiousness coming from all the fans. And so that's kind of how the noise thing started. And then there was this character that just appeared out of nowhere called Bill the Beer Man. And he was, he started out selling beers, and all of a sudden this guy is like leading cheers. And I was like, Dad, like, how can this guy lead cheers and his, the people that employ him would still, give him a job. Anyway, that just ended up being his shtick. And, so he started yelling, across the stadium. He had this big booming voice, and he would yell, "See!" And the other side was "Hawks!" And the back and forth. And then at some point, I think in season 2 or 3, and I think it started at the University of Washington, there was the Wave, and you bring that in, and he'd get that thing going, and he would literally spend the time to teach all the sections around the Kingdom how this thing was supposed to work. And so by the time, 2 or 3 games in the season goes, he's leading this Wave thing that starts, and this thing got rolling to where you'd have like 4 or 5 waves going simultaneously around the stadium at one time. And that's why they call it the Wave, because it was just crazy and lots of noise and fun. And, growing up, I didn't realize how, kind of stupid and idiotic it was, eventually. But when it was novel, when it first started, it was a lot of fun to be a participant in a crowd in the Kingdom. And it was very loud, and we loved to be able to affect plays and stuff. And so that lore of the 12th man began at that point. And it was a lot of fun. And we saw a lot of great, innovative games. That the talent on the field, early on, Keith, wasn't that good. Jack Patera was the coach. He'd been an assistant coach at Minnesota. Come over. We had an expansion draft. Steve Niehaus, I think, was the first player overall taken. He was a defensive tackle. We ended up getting Steve Largent in a trade. He was originally from Tulsa, but Dallas traded him to us. I believe it was Dallas. For almost nothing.
He was an 8th round pick, and they gave him to Seattle for next to nothing.
Yeah, right. And we had this kid, Jim Zorn, nobody'd ever heard about. He was a left-handed quarterback. I thought that was fantastic.
Undrafted.
Because I liked Fran Tarkington. So, and he kind of had that in him a little bit, and a little spunky guy. And it was just a lot of fun. The wins and losses at that point really didn't matter. And the expectations early for everyone were zero. And so I think early on, that first season we had 2 wins. I think one of those came against the other expansion franchise, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And just crazy. Jack Patera, the coach. I mean, it was, and I don't remember, Sherman, I think, was the running back. And I'm trying to, Steve Rabel was another wide receiver at that point, went on to be a great voice for the Seahawks. Mm-hmm. Pete Gross was the radio man early, and he called games fantastic. In fact, he ended up being in the Ring of Honor after he passed. Wayne Cody, dude, this guy was a big man, and he was just a fixture, on radio in Seattle at the time. But to see you never got to see these guys in person until you showed up at these events. And Wayne Cody'd go around the stadium, he'd high five people and yell, and so that was a lot of fun. And it was just a great experience growing up with a team like that. Really, it definitely stayed with me, obviously, to this very day. Just once you have that in you, it does not go away. Okay, so I've done my piece. How about you, Keith? How did it get started for you?
So for me, I was the team is a year older than I am. And so, and really, so I wasn't even here for the first year, and I don't remember much, other than my dad was a huge fan, like from day one, and watched the games and stuff. And he'd actually grown up a Raiders fan, not for any connection to the Raiders, but simply because they were the West Coast team. And, being from the Pacific Northwest, um, there wasn't a team up in that area. So you picked the most West Coast team. And to him, that was the Raiders. So he was a Raiders fan until, well, now there was a local team, and he was 100%, I'm going to support this team. This is our team. And so he, watched all the games and that. And so when I was little, I was always there. And um, I can remember watching a lot of games, not having any clue what I was watching, but I was just there hanging out with my dad. And then, 1983 was supposed to be a big deal. And this is, Chuck Knox is there, put together just an incredible defense, and drafted a running back that was going to carry this team, and looked like they were going to be a team that could go win a Super Bowl. And it was a big deal. So then the games became like must see. And so we sat down and watched every minute of every game. And again, I still had no idea what I was looking at. And being a little kid, did not get into the running game as much, but I was there. What got me was the '84 season, because in the first game, Kurt Warner goes down with a devastating knee injury, which took one of the more talented and just fun running backs ever, and really shortened his career. And
literally everyone, Keith, thought that season was lost when Kurt Warner went down,
because he was the offense the year before. And Chuck Knox was, ground Chuck is what they called him, because he was going to run the ball on every play. And he had, like, that was his thing. And instead he was forced to open up the offense and throw it around. And for 1 year we had air Chuck. And it was exciting. There was
Dave Craig emerged.
Yeah. Dave Craig really emerged, and Largent really excelled that year. And the offense was carried by the passing game. And this was much more fun and exciting. And that's what got me hooked, was watching Dave Craig sling the ball around, and, do fun things, make the playoffs, all of that. Like, they weren't good enough to contend for a Super Bowl that year, because you get into especially back then, you get into the playoffs. If you can't run the ball, you're not winning games. And they couldn't run the ball.
Well, they had a guy like Dan Dornick. Remember Dan Dornick?
Yes.
He's the guy that kind of took over for running the ball then.
Yeah.
And Hughes, a guy by the name of Hughes, I think, was there. We just didn't have really anybody. We scored a lot of points, but we couldn't really put up the yards.
Couldn't keep the other team off the field.
Yeah.
Couldn't run the clock later in games. They just, there was a lot of things that meant they weren't going to have playoff success. But during the regular season, that was a fun season. And like I said, that's the year that got me hooked. Was in '84. I mean, I was like 7. So it's, and still at that age, I don't know much about what I'm watching, but I knew that I liked what I was watching, and it was a lot of fun. And that's what really got me into football.
Well, I tell you, and that transition, that '83, '84 thing was really cool, because in '83 we exceeded all expectations. So the '83 thing, Chuck Knox came in. That was a big deal. That was our first big deal coach to come in and accept a position in Seattle. He had had much success with the Rams, had some great players that played under him and all that kind of stuff. We finished, I think 9-7, excuse me, something like that. We defeated the Denver Broncos in the wild card game, Keith. And there were no expectations that we could even get past Denver. Denver was kind of the arch nemesis of Seattle. Once in a while we'd get our wins in, but they usually won the day. And then, we went to the AFC Championship game. Well, after Denver, we went to Miami, and we had the game in Miami that nobody expected us to win. Dan Marino against David Craig. What, are you kidding me? And then Steve Largent had that reception at the end of the game, like the 40 yards some odd down the sideline catch to put us in a position to score. And we did. We ended up winning that game on the road and then facing the Los Angeles Raiders in the AFC Championship game. A lot of folks don't remember that, but I didn't have much hope that we'd win. I know my dad at the time was thinking, well, we weren't going to win, and we ended up not winning. But that's something else. And then the '84 season, we ended up going 12-4. We lost Kurt Warner down early in the season. We still had a great record. Dave Craig really came on and just carried that team. You mentioned the defense, Dave Brown and Harris, and Kenny Easley.
Was so good.
Yeah. And Jacob Green and Jeff Bryant. And, those sorts of guys came on, and, some of my favorite players, for sure. Dave Brown was just an amazing guy. Eugene Robinson came a little later, but, those guys, were fantastic, defensive backs, and just had ball hawks, and just, made stuff happen on the back end for sure.
Yeah. I just remember like that group, that defense just was smothering. One of the better defenses that Seattle, probably the best defense that Seattle had pre Legion of Boom era. And just overwhelmed teams at times.
It was when you had an undersized Joe Nash. Remember that in the middle? Yeah, he was in the middle there. Yeah, it was a fun team. Yeah. So okay, and then we kind of fluttered a while, and then Ken Behring ended up buying that team at some point. In the late '80s or something, or 1990 or something like that. Ken Behring bought that team.
Yep.
And then after that, we just really didn't do very well. Knox ended up leaving eventually. I think, was it Tom Flores? I think ended up coming in and being the coach. He was kind of a friend of Ken Behring.
He was a general manager and president before that, and then took over as coach after firing.
And he was a good executive. I think he also had some good coaching years there in with the Raiders.
He did. He won 2 titles with the Raiders.
Yeah. Took them to the Super Bowl, and so there was some hope that could continue, but we just didn't have the talent, the roster around him, and it turns out he wasn't really that great of a coach. I think it pointed more to the success that Oakland had in their front office, building a roster, than him as a coach, I think. But he ended up going into the Hall of Fame at some point, didn't he?
He went in
like a couple of years ago. As an executive.
He went in a couple of years ago, and it was as it was as a coach because of his time in Oakland.
Yeah.
Although I think at the time it was Los Angeles, but with the Raiders, we'll just go with that.
Right.
That really bugged me because, and maybe this is inaccurate because again, I was younger. But it felt like he came in to Seattle with the goal of tearing the franchise apart.
So
that way Ken Behring could move them, because he jettisoned talent, drafted as poorly as you possibly could, ran out a good coach, then became the coach and looked like an awful coach. And so it just was one of those things where you're like, how can a guy that won 2 titles be this bad? And then you start to think, well, maybe he's doing it on purpose, because he was friends with
Ken Behring.
And Ken Behring wanted the team to move to LA.
Yeah, Ken Behring started out, nobody really kind of knew what he was about, although there were some misgivings. I just remember being uneasy a little, and I was a kid, essentially, 20 something year old at that point. And I remember they moved like the executive offices first. like, and had them there in LA for a couple of seasons, yeah, operations. And then we hired like Dennis Erickson, I think after Flores. And somewhere in there is when the sneaky sort of behavior started happening with Ken Behring and company. And they moved this team in the middle of the night at one point. The team was in bankruptcy during this era. And it was just nuts. So Warren Moon was the quarterback during this time. I don't know if people remember Warren Moon being on the roster for very long, but he was there for a couple of seasons. And
I thought he came later after that. I thought this was still the Dave, like it was the Dave Craig era, and then it was like kind of that limbo between or right after Dave Craig when they were going with Kelly Stoffer and Dan McGuire and
you're right. Moon was right after Paul Allen bought the team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
So Behring, they were trying to move. One of his justifications for trying to move out of Seattle was he didn't think that the kingdom was earthquake safe, which is funny because he was trying to move the team to LA.
And it probably wasn't if it was in LA. I mean, Seattle, has a few shakes now and then, but there was a point in the kingdom, Keith, where tiles would start falling off the roof and all that kind of stuff. And it became a situation where you did feel a little unsettled in there. I'll be, completely honest. It was the cheapest possible building that they could build. At the time, I'm sure it was, millions and millions of dollars, but the King County owned that stadium. This was a county project, not the team. And, anyway. All right. So Dennis Erickson owns it. Ken Behring decides to transfer the team, to LA. That the league and the entire league and the league office completely protested, told him no uncertain terms. This thing basically was going to go into bankruptcy, and there was a chance that we could lose the franchise. And that's when Paul Allen stepped in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Flores had kind of run the team into the ground, both on a business standpoint as the team president and as a football standpoint as the general manager and coach. People stopped coming to games, and it was a mess. And so they were, the team was in bankruptcy. But honestly, the whole thing felt orchestrated. But the problem was he wanted to move them to LA. He was from there. That this felt like it was the idea from the beginning was that he wanted to try and get to LA because he thought that, biggest market and it's going to make money there and all that kind of stuff. But the league stepped in and said no, in part because the Rams and Raiders still were fighting, believing that they had rights to that market. And so you have to go through the league procedures for relocation, and they didn't do any of that. They were just, nope, suddenly we're an LA team. So the league stepped in and orchestrated the sale and got Behring out of there, which is the best thing that's ever happened to the Seahawks.
Agreed. And Paul Allen.
Yeah. And then Paul Allen is stepped in and bought the team, which is awesome. Like, I mean, that's been their thing. There's an interesting story with the Paul Allen purchase. I know there's like a lot of, at least around, because I live, in Southwest Washington. And so closer to Portland, and around here, everybody hates Jody Allen because of, the Trailblazers and all of that. But she's been very active with Seattle, the Seahawks. And there's a reason why the team has made like some pretty big moves and has continued to not be risk adverse while she's been in charge, because football is more her thing. And so when the team was leaving and all of that was happening in '88, she went to her brother, Jody Allen did, and said, being where we are financially as a family, we have a moral obligation to this community to use our resources to help, and convinced him to buy the Seahawks. We have a lot to thank, Jody Allen for, as far as keeping the NFL team in Seattle.
And, he spent $200 million on the franchise. And
yeah,
he worked out a deal to build a new stadium, and
Yep.
and that's the real big thing too. Major legacy for Paul Allen, really. I mean, you talk about an amazing owner, amazing person, a philanthropist, a guy that just really invested in the community. I mean, man, his signature is all over this franchise, and it started with the Nordstroms, and then the Ken Behring years, but then Paul Allen, and now Jody, and the trust, and it's a good situation. Jody's turned out to be a really good owner. I don't understand the angst there. I think there is some angst a little bit, only because of the way the trust was set up and kind of dictated that the team be sold at some point. I think there's been some clarity there over time, and there's no real move to sell the team, at least the Seahawks, in any near term. I think it's I heard something it's within the next 10 years or something like that.
Yeah, I heard. Well, basically it basically has like a 20-year limit. But one of the things that might happen is the trust might sell the team to Jody Allen.
Jody Allen.
And she would just take over as owner instead of the trust. But she's the owner now anyway, because she's the one in charge of the trust, so she runs the team. And she has done a good job with the Seahawks and what she's done, and it's been a good fit. But yeah, the whole Paul Allen like purchasing the team and everything. I mean, that was it was like
it was a godsend, really.
Yeah, I mean, it was
a franchise saving move. Yeah. So okay, so before we go into like the Mike Holmgren years and current history, tell me if you can, your top 5 ranked Seahawks from inception to the year 2000, and what you remember most about those seasons and those players and all that kind of stuff.
Well, one would be Steve Largent, simply because he was, as someone, I was pretty young then and didn't quite know what I was looking at in terms of the game. He was the guy that you saw a lot because he was the guy catching all the passes and uncoverable. I loved that he was described trying to cover him as like trying to cover air, because of his ability to just change direction and get you turned around and everything. Just one of the greatest in NFL history at getting separation and didn't ever drop a pass.
He led the team in receptions and yards for 12 consecutive seasons.
Yeah.
That's amazing. You think about what we've got now with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Those guys have been primo. Tyler Lockett, for 6 seasons. And then you think about Largent and just
12,
amazing. Yeah, amazing, really.
And he did all of that in an era where you got manhandled on every play by the cornerbacks, and there was no.
And he was in a tough division. Boy, Denver and Oakland had some of the best corners and most physical corners in the entire NFL.
Yeah, and just continued to be quietly dominate the whole time, and had tons and tons of NFL records, most of which were eclipsed by Jerry Rice not long after. But at one point he held them. Nowadays, like, those records don't seem as impressive because you look at modern passing stats and you're like, oh, well, there's a whole bunch of people that have eclipsed them. But the rules have certainly changed since then.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the quarterbacks have gotten more athletic and just better. I mean, to be completely honest, Steve Largent's quarterbacks were Jim Zorn and Dave Craig.
Yeah. That,
you know, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? I mean, those guys are great for Seahawks fans, but league wide, those are average middling guys. Dave
Mhm.
Craig had some amazing seasons though as a passer. Some of the smallest hands you'll ever see on a human being. They
Still,
couldn't have measured any more than like 8 inches,
oh,
you know,
they had to have been under that.
because he led the league. It's still, I mean, in the history of the National Football League, I mean, he's in the top 5 as far as fumbles.
He's number 1.
Um, Number 1 overall for fumbles as
Yeah.
a quarterback at any position.
Out of any position, he's got more
Yeah,
fumbles than anyone in NFL
but he
history.
but he also had like a stupid long 18-year career or something like that.
Yeah,
You know,
he did, and that's part of why he ended up with the
and
record was because
45,000 yards passing, and it's a crazy passing. He's top 10 quarterback in
yeah,
passing yards and stuff, which
still, but part of that is an
unbelievable.
18-year career,
Right.
and, like, just really long career, did and was I don't know, he's kind of he wasn't really, I wouldn't say call him the face of the Seahawks, but he was the leader of the offense. Him uh, and Largent, and it was
Yep.
just that's just what it was. So yeah, so those two are definitely my top 10. Walter Jones. As I learned more about football, later as we got into the later '80s and into the '90s, Walter Jones became um, such an underappreciated guy. And I look at left tackles that we've had since, and this is a guy that had like 5 holding penalties his entire career. Um,
Yeah.
Multiple year all pro left tackle with like 5 holding penalties in his final year. And like, I
And
think,
a literally a handful of sacks
yeah.
allowed.
Um, and of those 5 holding penalties, 2 of them came in his final game. Um,
And that's when he decided he didn't want to play anymore.
Yeah, well, because he was done. I mean, his knee
Yeah.
was shot.
Right. Right.
Um, and so it's been a long time with the team trying to find an answer. Uh,
Hmm.
and it's been hit and miss, mostly miss, trying to find an answer there. And unfortunately for some of the guys that have come after him, no one's ever going to live up to Walter Jones as a guy that's if that's the bar, if that's the standard, no one's ever going to reach it because he was that good.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then on the other side of the ball, I mean, Cortez Kennedy, how do you not? This is a guy that kind of revolutionized the position. Defensive tackles before him were the big fat guys that ate up space in the middle and stopped the run.
Hmm.
And that was it. Kennedy came in and was quick. He was into the backfield. He lived in the backfield. Um, was a sack like monster. A lot of tackles for loss against running backs, not because um, you know he was he was just unblockable at times. He would just go right between center and guard. They double team him; it wouldn't matter. And just a dominant player. Hall of Famer, multi-year All Pro. Um, one of the greatest ever. Really, he set the stage for a guy like Warren Sapp to exist. Another guy who is,
Hmm.
you know, a Hall of Famer,
Absolutely.
but teams probably wouldn't have given Warren Sapp the playing time and the ability to come in and do what he did because he would have being undersized. They would have viewed him as a guy that is only good on third down. Um, but Kennedy really changed what teams were looking for in defensive tackles. He wanted a guy that could get upfield and get penetration, and he was always fun to watch.
Yeah.
Um, and then after that, God, there's just a whole list of guys
Oh, sure.
um, that freaking love. But um,
Well, I'll tell you some players, out of the early era, and then we can talk about the latest history. But some of my favorite players, obviously, Steve Largent. I like Jim Zorn, Kurt Warner, Kenny Easley, and Dave Brown for sure. Steve
Kenny
Largent.
Kenny Easley is the name that that stands out. one of the greatest safeties to ever play it. And people don't
Yeah.
know that. They don't recognize him because he had a short career. But Ronnie Lott came out and started campaigning for Kenny Easley to make the Hall of Fame, saying that he thought that Easley was the only safety that had been better than him, and that
And
he
it's true.
deserved it. And honestly, like a lot of people would raise an eyebrow at that because Ronnie Lott might be the greatest of all time at the safety position, but Ronnie Lott thinks that Kenny Easley was better than him.
Yeah.
And that says a lot. Can you think about like the ego that guys at this level have and not wanting to say anything about that. But um Easley was so good, just the enforcer. And you think back just to the 83 season when he had 10 interceptions
Yeah.
as a safety. Nobody had interceptions
Yeah.
like that in a year. Um
Well, another guy I'll mention is Eugene Robinson. Now he doesn't get all the credit, and he had come some off the field stuff eventually. But as a football player, as a guy that was a ball, played on the ball, it was one of the best in the NFL. He ended up with like 56 or 60 interceptions in his career. The 50 of those were with the Seahawks. 50 interceptions. That's crazy. And then Jacob Green, I think, is underrated. To be completely honest,
Oh yeah.
the guy had 112 career sacks, and for three of his career seasons, they didn't keep those stats. So he had 3 years early in his rookie in his first and second year that they didn't even keep track of sacks yet as a stat. So I'm sure he had at least probably 20 more to add to that pile.
You could add Joe Nash into the group
Joe Nash,
of
what an
all-time greats as
underrated
well.
dog. That guy was a dog.
Oh yeah. It's right up front, nose tackle. You want to talk about doing the dirty work on every play. He made everyone around him better. So
all right.
just since we were talking about Easley and those guys, I looked it up real quick. That team 83 had 38 interceptions in a 14-game season.
Yeah, they had 5 in one game against Kansas City. And 3 of those were returned for touchdowns. I was at that game.
That would have been a fun game to go to. They turned the ball over 63 times in a 14-game season.
Wow.
Like do the math there, right?
It's hard. It's hard to turn the ball over that much.
That's 4 turnovers a game that this defense collected.
Okay, so before this show gets completely out of whack, let's talk
it's already out of whack.
Let's talk about the Mike Holmgren era, and then we got to give some props to Pete Carroll as well. So, Holmgren comes in 1999. The new stadium's getting built, new ownership, new direction. Holmgren, after Flores and Erickson, was a much needed turn. Holmgren came in having won the Super Bowl with the Green Bay Packers, came in with some gravitas, and kind of did turn this thing around. I'm trying to look and see. Started out with a 9-7 record in 1999.
That first 9-7 record is interesting because they were 8-2. And they looked like world beaters, and then could not get another win, and finally got one like the second to last game. And talk about backing into the playoffs. There is no greater example of backing into the playoffs than that team. But it did kind of set the tone for a team like that was going to be around and going to be a player.
It took them a while. I mean, the 2001, 2001, 2002 teams were not that good. Yeah, and it took them a little while to kind of develop. But by the time they got to the 2003 season, they were really good. Actually, they went 10-6, but they scored 404 points on offense, allowed 327 on defense. They really started coming on their own. But that 2005 season was special, not only because we went to the Super Bowl, but it was just a special season. Matt Hasselbeck came into his own. Sean Alexander had an MVP season. They had just a really nice roster overall. that was a fun season.
It
They ended
was.
up with. Go ahead.
I would say the whole season was derailed. And when I say derailed, I just mean they didn't win the Super Bowl, pretty much entirely because of playing fourth string safeties during the Super Bowl. Kenny Hamlin was the starting free safety, and he had gotten hit with the stop sign because someone had pulled a stop sign out and hit him over the head with it down at down there by the stadium.
Yeah.
At a nightclub. And so he ended up on IR, and then his backup ended up on IR, and they just didn't have any safeties left, and couldn't. And the whole thing just fell apart because of injuries. But all of it was at one position, and it was really unfortunate. But that was a good team.
Well, one
That
of
roster
the
was
favorite memories I have from that was the NFC Championship game against the Carolina Panthers at home. My dad and I went to that game, and that was the first time you reached the Super Bowl. Is just one of those moments that is etched and burned into you, and will never leave. It was just a special moment to reach that thing. Mike Holmgren, Sean Alexander had a great game. On the defensive side, we stopped Steve Smith and their quarterback, came in red hot, their offense, and we just shut them down. And then exploded enough on our offensive side of the ball. We won that game. That was just a celebration I'll never forget. It was just crazy. The mayhem.
Steve Smith was Offensive Player of the Year that year, I believe. Or what? Because it was like one of them was Alexander and the other one was Smith. Smith had just had what it was an unbelievable receiver or season as a receiver, and just put up these monster numbers and looked unstoppable. And what Seattle did to slow him down, which was weird and kind of crazy, and you still don't see teams do this today, but they put Leroy Hill, a linebacker, the weak side linebacker, out on him, not to cover him. The entire job was to just hit him,
knock him
at
off
the line of scrimmage on every play, and then release him and go do your linebacker things. But they literally lined a linebacker up on him to hit him on every play. And it worked because he didn't know what to do. The team didn't know what to do.
And Delhomme, their quarterback, was a timing guy.
Yeah. And it worked. And it was one of those tactical things that you come up with and you're like, God, it was really like, those are the kinds of things that you just notice. And you're just like, okay, this is what coaching is. This is what having a guy that can come in and do those things. It really does matter.
Yeah. And they were really one-dimensional. They came in one-dimensional. They were, and we had a good plan for them. That was fun. And we all know about the Super Bowl. Don't need to rehash that. But we got there. It just didn't work out. And that team eventually fell apart and transitioned to Mora after Holmgren left in, what was it, 2008? Mora came in 2009, single season, awful season, really. Took what was apparently a decent roster and just completely trashed it.
I mean, Holmgren's last year was 4-12. And yeah, there were a bunch of injuries and all of that, but the roster was old. It was not, it had deteriorated like crazy under Tim Ruskell, the general manager at the time. What was different with Mora was that the team was no longer well coached. They were a mess. There was talk of favoritism. And he had lost that locker room early on. And so even when at one point the executives were like, no, we should keep Mora probably because he's only had 1 year and because they signed him to a big contract. But guys had to step in and be like, no, we got to get rid of this guy because
Lewicki, I think was the executive that made that decision and went out to Los Angeles and basically camped with Pete Carroll for a while and got him to agree, because the year prior, Pete Carroll had been in discussions about coming into the NFL and he just didn't have a deal where he felt like he
Mhm.
could have enough control in order to build the system and the team and the culture that he felt like he needed. And
Yeah.
sure enough, that, you know, that single hire, and it was one of those hires where it wasn't completely well liked in Seattle at the time.
Oh,
He came
I
from
didn't like it.
USC. Everyone from the University of Washington State was very familiar with Pete Carroll, did not like him,
Mhm.
and so that was an amazing transformation, I have to say.
Really
That
smart.
once he got in to Seattle and spent a few seasons here, people got to know Pete and realized what kind of a human being he was. And
Mhm.
hats off to Pete Carroll, because that
So
was a tough deal to overcome, and he did.
I didn't like the hire of Pete Carroll. And it wasn't the college like, oh, I don't like him because he coached USC or any of that. It was more of his style, his like rah rah, style works good
It
with
almost seemed
kids.
arrogant from a distance, if you weren't really
Um,
paying attention.
I really question on whether it would work with pros.
Mm.
You look at his time in New England and the Jets, because he had two previous head coaching stints in the NFL. Neither of them went great, although in both of them, it was a case of a roster that was um, evaporating out from underneath him, and he didn't have any roster control or anything there, which is I think part of the reason why he wanted a situation like Seattle where they were going to give him control of those things because he looked bad in those previous stints because his GMs were bad. Um, but he'd gone to USC. He had tremendous success there, and we're like, okay, well, this is one of those guys that it works in college, but it's not doesn't mean it's going to work in the pros. And we've seen a lot of guys like that. Nick Saban comes to mind, who's probably the greatest college coach of all time, but was miserable in Miami when he was there, and I was worried that that's what this hire was, but it wasn't. Part of it was Carroll getting a chance to pick his own GM and doing such a good job getting a guy that he could work with. They have such a good relationship with him and Schneider. And part of it was me just not understanding all of what it means to make a culture, um, and to be in charge of an organization, not just a football team. And Carroll has done that as good as anyone in the NFL. And guys want to play here. Guys want to be here. Guys will, run through a wall for him. We've seen guys that were on the practice squad not taking 53-man roster jobs on other teams because they didn't want to leave Seattle. And that has all to do with Carroll and the environment that he created around this team.
No, absolutely. And a winning culture.
Mhm.
This franchise historically had not had very many winning seasons. And in between winning seasons, there were a lot of losing seasons, a lot of
Yep.
heartache, a lot of bad play, a lot of bad quarterbacks, etc. One of the exciting things when he came in addition to bringing that culture, which was evident right away, was the fact that they needed to and wanted to turn this roster over and make it into his image. And they took a 5-win team or whatever it was, to a 7-win team, and somehow or another eked into the playoffs that first year. Um, and 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 or was it the second year? I
No, it
can't
was the
remember.
first year. The
First
first
year.
year came,
And then
came in.
traded for Marshawn Lynch was a big deal. We didn't know it at the time, because he had kind of failed and washed out in Buffalo. And it turns out it really wasn't his situation. He's kind of a misunderstood guy, but extremely talented and character and physical, just a physical beast of a running back. And when he came in, it took him a while, but they
Mhm.
got to that playoff game, and in that one play, Beastquake completely changed the identity of the team. Not only the offense, but the team itself became this larger than life Beastquake. I'm going to run you over type of mentality. and that carried over to, to the next season. It didn't go as well. We still won 7 games, but they continued to turn that roster around. We had a good draft. And then we got to that 2012 season. Bobby Wagner came on, Russell Wilson, um, which I believe should be mentioned as far as some of the great players that we've been talking about. I know he had a rough exit and season last year, but what he was able to do for this franchise, I think, is right up there with some of the greats. Deserves to be on the Ring of Honor at some point in his life, and that turnaround with Pete Carroll instigating that, and then the run we started making in 2012. As we got better and Russell Wilson got better as the year went on, and we almost eked that thing out in Atlanta in his rookie season, and we were ready that 2013 season to really make a run. And it was a remark that 3 years we just weren't used to that as fans, being able to turn around a really bad roster, and all of a sudden we're in discussions about being a really, really good team. And we were a really good team, and it was fantastic.
I mean that um, the whole transition with that roster was interesting because him coming in and wanting to turn the roster over coincided with a weird collective bargaining issue that the league had been having with the union, and they ended up with an uncapped year. So there was 1 year with no salary cap,
Oh, I
which
forgot about that.
meant there was no salary cap rules, which meant you could cut guys with bad contracts and not have the whole dead money issue.
Like
So
Hushmanzada.
they unloaded some bad contracts. TJ Hushmanzada comes to mind, where they paid him like $8 million to play for someone else. Not that he wasn't still a player or anything, but they just didn't want that contract, and it gave them an opportunity to get rid of it. And they were able to just unload some bad contracts, and they got really young really fast. Um, and they churned the roster like 200 and was it 232 roster moves in a year.
And they had some
Uh,
decent draft picks. They had some decent draft picks. They drafted early in the draft that, I think in 2011. They ended up getting Russell Okung and Earl Thomas,
mhm.
in the first round, yeah, just great draft, like 2 or 3 great drafts in a row made that team. And
Yeah, it
and
really
and
did.
also, hats off to Schneider as well, as far as free agency is concerned as well.
Mhm.
Um, it kept Brandon Mebane for a while, and went out and got um, Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill, and yeah, and then lucked out really with Richard Sherman turning out to be, world's greatest cornerback for a time there, and Earl Thomas to play the back end, and Cam Chancellor and Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright. I mean, the list was just a huge, um, and what a fun time to be a fan. And the last several years have been hard at some level. Still kind of a playoff team, but fringy, and not when we get to the playoffs, we haven't been doing well. And there's been a lot of complaints about Pete Carroll and needing to move on, and he's archaic and he deserves to go, and he just hasn't kept up with the times and so forth. I would argue just the opposite in a sense, in that he's one of the most adaptable coaches I've ever seen, to be
He
completely honest.
he's actually done a good job in terms of that. There was a point where there was a realistic, I believe, people talking about the league kind of passing him by because he was refusing to adapt, wanting to run the same defense, the same offense, not change things. Um, and they with continual diminishing returns as it went. But what happened was I think he recognized what was going on. The whole like, let's run this back and do it another year because we've got this nice core. And if we can just put it together, we can win another Super Bowl. And they were trying to not change until it got to a point where they just kind of had to. And
Hmm.
at that point, it wasn't, I don't think it was Pete Carroll trying to be stubborn. It was trying to just do what what he could do to get another win. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And he had a core talent and all of that, and didn't want to have to um, change the roster in order to change the system until they got to a point where they had to. And he's jettisoned the defensive coaching staff and brought in a new one. Then he did it again in order to try and get to a point where they had it was more adaptable, completely changed the offensive scheme and what they want to do. Yes, they're still running the ball a lot, but the whole organization of it is so much different from early to the Brian Schottenheimer years, and then to what it is now under Shane Waldron. So the like everything is different. He's evolved in a way that I think people just don't give him credit for. Running a completely different system on defense, a completely different system on offense. But what hasn't changed is Pete Carroll and the culture of winning that he creates
Yeah.
behind the scenes.
Well, I think the sheer talent on defense that he had was the difference. I mean, you go take a look at the point differentials he had between 2012 and 2015, they were substantial. 167 in 2012, 186, 140, 146. After the 2015 year, it went down to 62, then 34, then 81, then 7. And then last year it was 6. You know, there's the point differential on, and that's how you win games. Is you score more points than you give up, and when it's that close, you're going to be a 500 team at best. And so as far as like getting ready for this season, I expect that to really start to turn now. You got an offense that's going to be explosive. I expect them to score close to 450 points in the regular season. And I expect that defense, instead of giving up 400 points, I expect them to give up closer to 300 points. And so I expect now to start to see that transformation where we can put up, 12, 13 wins. And we're in that kind of conversation right now, that sort of window. And as far as Pete Carroll is concerned, I think he's cemented for me as the best coach in Seahawks history, and deserving to be in the Hall of Fame. And I, for one, when he's gone, Keith, it's going to be a sad day for me, because there's something about Pete Carroll and that culture that is unique and special. And another coach may come in and win, and may not. But we went through a very long history. This franchise has been going now, we determined, close to 47 years. There's been a couple of good coaches in this history. And we've only had 8 head coaches in that whole time, but it's been a remarkable run here this last 13 years. And I think hopefully another few.
You said it only had 8 head coaches, which is actually like Jacksonville does that in like 10 years.
Remarkably stable.
But it does make me think of Pittsburgh, who's on their 3rd head coach, and the team has been around for like 40 years longer.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
Talk about whatever they do to hire coaches. Like, why doesn't other teams match that?
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think you just get lucky. You just get lucky. You do. Everything's got to line up. You've got to have the personnel. You've got to have the GM. You've got to have the players, obviously, but you've got to also be a great coach. You're going from Chuck Noll to, Mike Tomlin. Wow.
Yep.
And then, you go from Mike Holmgren to Pete Carroll. I mean, that's a great run. That's a great run, really. Yeah. It doesn't get much better than that in the NFL. There's so much parity. There really is. It's built to be have parity.
Everything.
So when you have coaching that's better than at league average, you put yourself in the best place to be successful. And I think, both Mike Holmgren and Pete Carroll did that and continue to do that. So anywho, you want to talk about anything else? We might as well. We're at 58 minutes and we could keep going for a while. So out of the last, since 2010, who are your favorite players, Keith?
It's weird because like certain things happen and then, the opinion kind of changes. And I loved Richard Sherman when he was in Seattle. I also know that he talked some crap on his way out, and
as he will do.
And that wasn't a great look and all of that, but man, on the field, he was such a dominant player. He was so good.
Yeah. And when
Or
it's all said and done later, and those things won't matter.
Yep. And a part of it though was that um, he didn't get along with Russ. And at the time, it was a bad look for Sherman because it was like, oh, well, you're just jealous and all of that, which it very much appeared to be, and there was an element of that. Um, but as things soured between Russ and Seattle, a lot of what Sherman was saying, like, it kind of came to fruition. Um, and it's like maybe people needed to have listened to Sherman more. And it would have been good. So he was there. Earl Thomas, I know, man, he's had some real issues since leaving Seattle, but one of the greatest safeties to ever play the game. Put him right up there with easily. Just dominant player. Um,
Cam Chancellor.
Oh, Cam
Yeah.
Chancellor
Yeah.
works. I
Right.
mean, you're right. You were just talking about these are the Legion of Boom guys, right?
Yeah. Well,
They
here's
really,
the deal, Keith. It's they're all individually great players. They are.
Mhm.
They would have been great players on any team. It's what they did together. It's like it was magic. It really was.
Well, and you got to include Bobby Wagner in all of this. And if you don't, you're crazy. Because he's such an integral piece of everything, being that
Yeah.
guy in the very middle, Hall of Fame guy, talent, and just, yeah, fantastic. Um,
Yeah. And Baldwin and Lynch, Marshawn Lynch, and then you add in Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill and I mentioned Cam Chancellor. And the team was just special. That 4 or 5 year, 6 year run where all those guys were on the roster. It's just it's a that sort of level of team, and especially on the defense, where you had kind of a historic. You led the team in league in scoring against 3 or 4 consecutive years, which is unheard of. And it's definitely a testament to how they played together. All
yeah.
right. I think that's it. I mean, we got everybody caught up to the current year, basically. How do you feel about this roster compared historically to other rosters?
I think that it's got good talent. Um, what it I know you and I disagree on this. I don't like the depth as much. I don't think it's a complete roster. Um, but honestly, the offense, find me a more talented offense in Seahawks history. I don't think you're
Yeah,
gonna find one.
I agree with you.
And the defense, though, I think when you compare it to, the Chuck Knox era or the earlier Pete Carroll era, it really just doesn't stand up.
Last year, we gave up the most points against, um, the third most points against in franchise history last
And
year.
there's
Now there's
and there was
17 games now, yes, but nonetheless,
there's also
it's not.
some really bad teams in franchise history.
Mhm.
We went this entire show without mentioning the 1992 team that was 2-14. Uh, but now
Yeah,
we did.
but
But anyways,
it allowed us to draft Kennedy though, or no, Kennedy was on that team, wasn't he?
Kennedy was on that team. He
Kennedy
was
was on that team.
I think he was defensive player of the year
Yeah.
on a 2-14 team
Wow.
because he had I think he had 16 sacks.
We scored 140 points that year.
Yeah, the most anemic offense of all time.
We scored 400 last year, just to give you an idea.
So there was also, you're talking about anemic offense. Just trivia question. There was a game in '79 where the Seahawks had what's considered to be the worst offensive performance ever in league history, where they ended up with -7 total yards of
Wow.
offense.
Was that against Kansas City?
I believe it was.
At Kansas City, where Smith had like 6 or 7 sacks.
Hmm. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was bad.
It was a Rain Bowl. Remember the rain was no, that wasn't it. I think that was like a Warren Moon era game. But yeah, no, I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, I'm 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 very curious to see the improvement on the defensive side of the ball this year, because when you really take a look at it, and we thought, well, maybe the defense is better. Nah, they're pretty crappy. They were pretty crappy last year. That both in rankings in terms of stopping the run, defending the pass, points allowed, etc. Somehow or another, I feel really good about the defense this year, and I haven't quite put it together. You mentioned it, like I feel better than you do, and I think
You
that's
do.
true. But nonetheless, we gave up a ton of points last year and a ton of yards, and somehow or
Mm-hmm.
another, we need to get better at that. Why are my expectations so much better this year?
I
As
don't
far
know.
as being able to have the defense come in and be 20-25% better on points allowed. I said we might go from 400 to 300 this year. I don't know if that's true. I just know it's going to be closer to 300, I think, than 400.
Yeah, I don't know why you're quite so.
Maybe the offense is going to be so great that the defense won't have to be on the field as much. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm pretty excited about it, though. I really am. I think this is an opportunity for the Seahawks to be really good this year, and it really is going to come down to the defense. I think, as far as how far we can go, because if we have a really good defense and it improves quite a bit, even if it's league average or slightly better, when I think it can be, we could end up being in that NFC Championship game conversation for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the NFC is primed to for the Seahawks to run through. The defense has to do it.
All right, fun show. Thank you, Keith. I appreciate the memory row. That was a lot of fun. You can find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL. You can find me at NW Seahawk. The show is Seahawks Playbook Podcast on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button, share it, leave a great comment and review. That would be outstanding. We appreciate you guys very much. So until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook Podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.